You don't belong here. The words echoed across the upscale restaurant so loudly that every conversation came to a stop. An elderly woman, dressed in a faded blue cardigan and worn-out sneakers, froze beside the hostess stand. Her hands trembled as she clutched a small paper gift bag against her chest. I think my son made a reservation, she said softly, glancing around the elegant dining room. The restaurant manager let out a sarcastic laugh. Ma'am, our guests don't show up carrying grocery bags and wearing clothes like that. I need you to leave before you're escorted out. A few people looked away. Others quietly pulled out their phones. No one moved. No one said a word. Then a calm voice broke the silence. Actually, she's staying. Every head turned. A young woman in a simple green sweater stood from a nearby table. She couldn't have been older than 26. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she looked more like a schoolteacher than someone dining in one of Chicago's most expensive restaurants. Her name was Emily Carter. She worked as an elementary school teacher on the city's west side, where she spent her days buying school supplies with her own paycheck because many of her students' families couldn't afford them. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't powerful. But she had something far rarer. She couldn't ignore someone being treated unfairly. The manager frowned. Excuse me? Emily stepped closer to the elderly woman. If she says she's waiting for someone, maybe we should let her wait. The manager crossed his arms. And who exactly are you? Just another customer. Then enjoy your meal and stay out of our business. Emily looked around the room. Dozens of people. Designer suits. Luxury handbags. Expensive watches. Not one person was willing to stand beside an old woman who looked scared and embarrassed. She took a slow breath. No, Emily said firmly. This became everyone's business the second you started humiliating her in front of an entire restaurant. A quiet murmur spread through the dining room. The manager's face reddened. Young lady, appearances matter in a place like this. Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. So, kindness doesn't. The elderly woman gently touched Emily's arm. It's all right, dear, she whispered. I don't want any trouble. Emily smiled warmly. Sometimes trouble finds good people anyway. The old woman lowered her eyes, clearly trying not to cry. My son told me to meet him here, she explained. It's his birthday today. He insisted we celebrate together. The manager rolled his eyes. Of course he did. Emily noticed something. The woman wasn't lying. She kept checking an old silver wristwatch every few seconds, the nervous habit of someone afraid of disappointing another person, not someone trying to scam a free meal. What time did your son say he'd be here? Emily asked. 7. Emily glanced at the clock. 6:57. Only 3 minutes early. The manager snapped his fingers toward a security guard. Remove her. The guard hesitated. He looked uncomfortable. Before he could move, Emily stepped between him and the elderly woman. If you're throwing her out, Emily said, then you'll have to throw me out too. The room fell silent. The guard looked at the manager, unsure what to do. The manager forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Fine. He pointed toward the exit. Both of you can leave. Emily didn't flinch. If that's your decision, I'd like to pay for my meal and file a formal complaint with the owner. The manager chuckled. The owner? You think you'll ever meet him? Emily answered without raising her voice. Maybe not. But someone should know how customers are treated here. A businessman sitting near the window quietly nodded. A young couple exchanged uncomfortable looks. The atmosphere had shifted. People were beginning to realize the manager had gone too far. Just then, the restaurant's front door opened. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit walked inside with 2 colleagues trailing behind him. He looked to be in his late 30s, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to making difficult decisions. He stopped the moment he heard the raised voices. What seems to be the problem? The manager hurried over with an eager smile. Good evening, sir. Just handling a disturbance. The man glanced past him. His eyes landed on the elderly woman.
Everything about him changed.
The confidence disappeared. His face turned pale. Mom? The elderly woman looked up, relief flooding her eyes. Daniel? Without another word, The man rushed across the lobby and wrapped his arms around her as though he hadn't seen her in years. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "Traffic was worse than I expected." She smiled through tears. "I knew you'd come." The restaurant fell completely silent. The manager stared in confusion. "You know this woman?" The man slowly turned around. His expression was no longer warm. It was ice cold. "I don't just know her." He placed a protective hand on his mother's shoulder. "She's my mother." The manager forced a nervous laugh. "Oh, what a wonderful surprise." But Daniel wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes had settled on Emily. He had noticed exactly where she was standing, between his mother and everyone who had abandoned her. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel asked quietly, "Were you the only person who stood up for her?" Emily shrugged. "I just did what anyone should have done." Daniel looked around the room, taking in the lowered eyes, the uncomfortable faces, the manager sweating through his expensive suit. His jaw tightened. "You'd be surprised," he said softly, "how few people actually do." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made one brief call.
His voice was calm.
"Michael, come downstairs." There was a pause. "Yes."
"Now."
He ended the call, without another word. The manager swallowed hard. "Sir, if there's been some misunderstanding, I'm sure we can." Daniel cut him off. "Oh, there's been a misunderstanding." He looked directly into the manager's eyes. "You assumed my mother's worth based on her clothes." The manager opened his mouth, but no words came out. Then Daniel said something that made the entire restaurant hold its breath. "And in less than 5 minutes, you're going to find out exactly whose restaurant this is." The manager's smile disappeared. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Then the elevator doors near the back of the restaurant opened. A man in his early 50s, wearing a navy business suit and carrying a tablet, walked quickly toward Daniel. "Mr. Whitmore," he said. "You asked for me?" The manager's eyes widened. He knew exactly who this man was. Michael Benson, Chief Operating Officer of the Whitmore Hospitality Group. The man who oversaw more than 80 luxury restaurants and hotels across the country. Michael stopped beside Daniel and immediately noticed Margaret. "Oh my goodness," he said, gently taking her hands. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you all right?" Margaret smiled politely. "I'm fine now, Michael." Daniel nodded toward the manager. "I want you to tell me exactly who hired him." The manager interrupted nervously. "Mr. Whitmore, I can explain. We were simply following our dress code policy." Daniel looked at him. "Really?" "Yes, sir." "So, show me the policy." The one that says elderly mothers wearing inexpensive clothes aren't welcome." The manager's face drained of color. "There isn't one." "I thought so." Emily quietly stepped back. She suddenly realized this wasn't just some successful businessman. This was Daniel Whitmore, the billionaire entrepreneur whose family owned hotels, restaurants, and commercial properties in nearly every major American city. She'd seen his name in local news articles after he'd donated millions to rebuild schools damaged by storms. He rarely gave interviews, rarely attended social events. People described him as intensely private. No one had mentioned that his mother dressed like an ordinary retiree. Daniel turned toward Margaret. "Mom, I'm sorry." She looked confused. "Why are you apologizing?" "I should have picked you up myself." She squeezed his hand. "You've always worked too hard." Daniel smiled sadly. "And you've always defended me." Margaret laughed softly. "That's what mothers do." Emily couldn't help smiling. There was something refreshingly genuine about them. No expensive jewelry. No dramatic display. Just a son worried about his mother. Daniel faced the dining room. "I'd like to ask everyone here something." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. "If my mother had walked in wearing a designer dress..." He paused. "Would anyone have questioned whether she belonged here?" Silence. One woman lowered her eyes. A businessman quietly folded the newspaper he'd been pretending to read. Daniel continued. "My father built this company with one promise." He glanced at an old framed photograph hanging near the entrance. "Treat every guest with dignity. Not because of what they own, but because they're human." He looked back at the manager. "You failed that promise tonight." The manager finally spoke. I've worked here 11 years. I've never had a complaint like this. Daniel nodded. I believe you. Hope flashed across the manager's face. Then Daniel added, because most people who are humiliated simply leave. They don't have someone willing to stand beside them. His eyes shifted toward Emily. But tonight, they did. Emily immediately looked uncomfortable. I really don't need credit. Daniel smiled. I'm not giving you credit. I'm giving you thanks. Before Emily could answer, Margaret stepped forward. She gently hugged her. The unexpected embrace caught Emily completely off guard. Thank you for seeing me, Margaret whispered. So many people looked at my clothes. You looked at my face. Emily felt tears sting her eyes. You reminded me of my grandmother. Margaret smiled. Then she must have been a wonderful woman. Emily's expression softened. She was. She raised me after my parents passed away. Margaret's eyes filled with sympathy. I'm so sorry. Emily nodded. We didn't have much. But she always told me. She laughed through the emotion. You never know what someone is carrying inside them. So carry kindness first. Margaret gently touched Emily's cheek. Your grandmother raised you well. Daniel quietly listened. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something unexpected.
Peace.
Not because the situation had been resolved, but because someone had protected the one person he loved most without expecting anything in return. Michael cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, the board members have arrived upstairs. Daniel barely looked at him. They can wait. They've already been waiting 30 minutes. They can wait another 30. Michael smiled. I'll let them know. As he turned away, Daniel stopped him. Actually, Michael looked back. I've changed my mind. I want every board member downstairs. The manager blinked. Sir? Daniel never looked at him. If tonight is going to become a lesson, I'd rather everyone learn it together. Within minutes, 12 executives entered the restaurant. Some looked confused. Others immediately sensed something was terribly wrong. Daniel stood beside his mother. Emily remained near the entrance, wishing she could quietly disappear. She hated attention. One executive whispered, Who's the young woman? Michael answered quietly, the only customer who defended Mrs. Whitmore. Several executives turned toward Emily with newfound respect. Daniel addressed them. I asked you all here because leadership isn't measured inside conference rooms. It's measured when nobody important is watching. He paused. Tonight, everyone thought nobody important was watching. The words landed heavily. The manager stared at the floor. Daniel walked toward him. I'm not firing you because you embarrassed my mother. The manager looked up hopefully. I'm firing you because I believe you've embarrassed countless people before her, and they simply didn't have anyone to speak for them. Security quietly approached. The manager didn't resist. As he was escorted toward the exit, he stopped in front of Emily. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I'm sorry. Emily looked at him for a long moment. I hope you mean that. He nodded once. I do. After he left, the restaurant remained silent. No applause. No celebration. Just reflection. Daniel finally turned toward Emily. I know this may sound unusual. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. But would you allow my mother and me to buy you dinner? Emily laughed awkwardly. I think I interrupted your family celebration. Margaret smiled. You became part of it. Emily looked from Margaret to Daniel. Something told her this chance meeting wasn't going to end with one dinner. She just didn't know how much it was about to change all of their lives. And neither did Daniel, because by the end of the evening, his mother would quietly tell him something about Emily that would make him question everything he thought he knew about fate. Emily hesitated. I really don't want to intrude. Margaret slipped her arm through Emily's. Sweetheart, after what you did for me tonight, you're not intruding. Daniel smiled. My mother doesn't usually take no for an answer. Margaret laughed. He's right. Emily finally smiled back. Well, in that case, I'd be honored. For the first time all evening, the tension in the restaurant melted away. The remaining staff hurried to prepare a private dining room upstairs. Daniel noticed several employees looking nervous. He addressed them before anyone could disappear into the kitchen. I want everyone to hear me. The server stopped.
So, do the chefs.
So does housekeeping. If anyone here believes they're in trouble because of what happened tonight. He shook his head. You're not. This wasn't the failure of an entire team. It was the failure of one leader. Several employees visibly relaxed. One young waitress wiped away tears. She quietly approached Margaret. I'm so sorry, ma'am. I wanted to say something. I was scared I'd lose my job. Margaret reached for her hand. I understand. Fear had a way of silencing good people. I hope next time you'll speak anyway. The waitress nodded, her voice breaking. I will. As everyone headed upstairs, Emily leaned toward Margaret. You forgave her pretty quickly. Margaret smiled. When you've lived as long as I have, you learn something. People who are cruel by choice and people who are silent out of fear aren't always the same.
Emily thought about that.
She'd spent years teaching children that mistakes didn't have to define them. Maybe adults needed that reminder just as much. The private dining room overlooked Chicago's skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city lights, but Margaret seemed more interested in the birthday cake waiting at the center of the table. Oh my, she laughed. You remembered Lemon. Daniel smiled. You've ordered the same birthday cake for me since I was 8. I figured it was my turn. Margaret's eyes shimmered. I used to bake it from scratch. And every year you pretended it wasn't lopsided. Daniel chuckled. It usually was. It absolutely was. Emily couldn't help laughing with them. Watching the two of them together was almost surreal. One of the richest men in America, teasing his mother over crooked birthday cakes. No assistants. No bodyguards hovering nearby. Just family. Daniel noticed Emily watching.
What?
She smiled. You two don't act like I expected. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What did you expect? Emily laughed nervously. I don't know. More billionaire. Daniel burst into laughter. What exactly does billionaire look like? Emily shrugged. I guess I imagine someone who checks stock prices between bites. Margaret grinned. Oh, he used to. Daniel groaned. Mom. No, it's true. She looked at Emily. When Daniel was 29, he almost missed Thanksgiving dinner because he kept answering business calls. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. I remember. I finally told him that money was a terrible dinner guest. Emily smiled. Sounds like good advice. It was. Daniel looked out the window for a moment. I almost forgot it. There was something in his voice that made Emily curious. Not sadness, exactly. Regret. Margaret noticed it too. You've been lonely. Daniel sighed. Mom. It's all right. She looked at Emily. My son has built companies. He's made magazines. He's made fortunes. But he hasn't made much time for himself. Daniel smiled weakly. I walked right into that one. Emily spoke gently. Success doesn't always leave room for life. Daniel looked at her. You understand that? She nodded. I've seen teachers work 3 jobs. My grandmother worked until she was 72. Sometimes survival becomes such a habit. You forget you're supposed to be living. The room fell quiet. Daniel found himself studying Emily. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't impressed by his wealth. She simply spoke honestly. And that was surprisingly rare. As dessert arrived, Margaret excused herself. I'll be right back. She disappeared down the hallway toward the restroom. Daniel and Emily sat in an unexpected silence. Finally, Daniel smiled. So, you've probably Googled me by now. Emily laughed. I actually haven't. You haven't?
No.
Aren't you curious? She shrugged. I already know the important part. Daniel looked puzzled. And what's that? You love your mom. He blinked. Everything else is just details. For a moment, Daniel didn't know what to say. He'd spent years wondering whether people liked him, or simply liked what came with his name. Tonight, for the first time in a very long while, someone had answered that question without even realizing it. Emily changed the subject. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why was your mother dressed so simply? Daniel smiled. Because that's how she's always been. Even now. especially now. He leaned back in his chair. When I sold my first company, I bought her a luxury SUV. What happened? She traded it in for a used Honda. Emily laughed.
No.
Yes. And she donated the difference to a children's hospital. Emily shook her head. That's incredible. She said she only needed a car that started every morning. Daniel smiled to himself. She's impossible. She sounds wonderful. She is. Just then, Margaret returned. She looked unusually thoughtful. She sat down quietly, watching Daniel and Emily talking. Neither of them noticed. A slow smile crossed her face. She had raised her son alone after losing her husband. She had watched him sacrifice friendships, relationships, and almost every chance at happiness while building an empire. For years, she'd prayed that someone would one day see Daniel. Not the billionaire. Not the businessman. Just her son. Tonight, she'd watched a young teacher do exactly that. She folded her hands and said softly, "Daniel." He looked over. "Yes, Mom. I think your father would have liked her." Daniel nearly choked on his coffee. Emily's eyes went wide. The room fell silent for 2 long seconds. Then Margaret smiled innocently. "What?" Daniel laughed in embarrassment. "Mom, we've known each other for, what, an hour?" Margaret tilted her head. "Sometimes an hour tells you more about a person than 10 years. Emily felt her cheeks grow warm. She quickly reached for her water glass, hoping to hide the blush creeping across her face. She had no idea that Margaret's simple remark was about to set off a chain of events that neither she nor Daniel could have imagined. Because, less than 24 hours later, Emily would receive devastating news that threatened to destroy the small, meaningful life she'd built. And the first person to show up at her door would be Daniel Whitmore. Emily barely slept that night. Margaret's teasing words kept replaying in her mind, but by morning, they were the last thing she was thinking about. Her phone rang just after 7. "Miss Carter?" "Yes. This is Principal Reynolds." His voice sounded unusually heavy. "I need you to come to the school as soon as you can." Emily's stomach tightened. "Is one of my students okay?" "It's about your position." She arrived 20 minutes later to find several teachers gathered in the staff room, many of them fighting back tears. The district had announced unexpected budget cuts. The elementary school where Emily had taught for 5 years would be closing at the end of the semester. Nearly everyone would lose their jobs. Emily sat quietly, unable to process the news. Her students came from struggling families. For many of them, school wasn't just a place to learn. It was where they got their only hot meals, where they felt safe, and where someone believed in them. Now that place was disappearing. As she packed a few books into a cardboard box, there was a gentle knock on her classroom door. She looked up. Daniel Whitmore stood there, holding 2 cups of coffee. She blinked in surprise. "What are you doing here?" He handed her one of the cups. "My mother called me this morning." Emily smiled faintly. "She works fast. She was worried about you." Emily looked down. "I didn't even know she knew where I worked." Daniel laughed. "Once my mother decides your family, she learns everything." For the first time that day, Emily laughed. Then the smile faded. "I just lost the job I love." Daniel looked around the classroom. Every shelf was filled with donated books, handmade art projects, and photos of smiling children. "You didn't lose what you love." She looked at him. "You just lost the building." Emily sighed. "I don't understand." Daniel walked over to a bulletin board covered in handwritten notes. One read, "Thank you for believing I could read out loud." Another said, "You're my favorite teacher because you never gave up on me." Daniel turned back to her. Those kids didn't fall in love with the school. They fell in love with their teacher. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "What if you didn't have to leave?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" He smiled. "I made a few phone calls on the way here." Emily looked confused. "What kind of phone calls?" "The kind that buy buildings." 3 months later, the old school had become something entirely new. The Carter Community Learning Center. A free after-school program offering tutoring, meals, counseling, music classes, and scholarships for children from low-income families. The name on the front of the building embarrassed Emily. She had argued against it for weeks. Daniel and Margaret had refused to change it. Margaret simply said, "Kindness deserves to be remembered." The center quickly became one of the most respected community programs in Chicago. Teachers who had lost their jobs were hired back. Hundreds of children found a second home. And every Friday afternoon, Margaret volunteered in the library, reading stories to the youngest students. She insisted they call her Grandma Maggie. The children happily did. As for Daniel and Emily, their friendship grew slowly. There were no dramatic declarations, no whirlwind romance,
Just coffee after work.
long conversations, community events, Sunday dinners with Margaret. Daniel discovered that Emily challenged him in ways no board member ever had. She reminded him that success wasn't measured by quarterly profits, but by the lives touched along the way. Emily discovered that behind the headlines and business magazines was a man who still called his mother every evening, who secretly hated fancy parties, and who found more joy fixing broken playgrounds than attending billionaire galas. A year later, Daniel asked Emily to take a walk along the Chicago River where they had shared one of their first conversations. He reached into his pocket. Emily laughed. "Please tell me that's not what I think it is." Daniel smiled nervously. "I've negotiated billion-dollar contracts. This is somehow scarier." She laughed. "I noticed." He took a deep breath. "The night we met, I thought I was coming to celebrate my birthday. But I ended up finding the person who reminded me what my father spent his whole life trying to teach me." He looked into her eyes. "That character will always outshine wealth." He held out a small velvet box. "Emily Carter. You defended someone you didn't know because it was the right thing to do. You changed my mother's life that evening. You changed mine too. Will you marry me?" Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked toward a nearby park bench. Margaret was sitting there with a knowing smile, pretending to read a book upside down. Emily burst into laughter. "She's been spying on us, hasn't she?" Daniel sighed dramatically. "For at least 20 minutes. Margaret lowered the book. "I was supervising." Emily shook her head, tears filling her eyes. Then she turned back to Daniel. "Yes. Of course I'll marry you." People walking nearby applauded as Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger. Margaret wiped away happy tears. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew it from the moment she stood beside me." On their wedding day, there were no celebrity performances, no extravagant displays, and no headlines invited. Instead, the front row was filled with the children Emily had taught over the years. Several former students gave speeches about how one kind teacher had changed the course of their lives. One little girl ended her speech with words that left everyone in tears. "Miss Carter always said that kindness is something you give away, but somehow never lose." Daniel looked at Emily and smiled. She was right. Years later, a framed photograph hung in the entrance of every Whitmore hotel and restaurant. It wasn't a picture of Daniel accepting an award. It wasn't a photo of a luxury property. It showed an elderly woman in a faded blue cardigan smiling beside a young teacher in a simple green sweater. Underneath were the words, "Treat every guest with dignity. You never know who they are, but more importantly, you never know what they've been through." Every new employee read those words on their first day. And every manager knew the story behind them. Not because a billionaire's mother had been humiliated, but because one ordinary woman chose kindness when everyone else chose silence. Sometimes, the greatest opportunities don't come from knowing the right people. They come from being the right person.